I do think that Donald Trump appropriates working class communication styles very well, and that is a big part of his success. It's also a lot of other things. He is probably the biggest modern peddler of great replacement theory, and I'm not disputing that at all, but I have seen that talked about, and I have nothing new to add to that conversation. But I do see a lot of people critiquing, like, oh, if the media hadn't done this, he never would have gotten attention, etc. And I think something that people don't even realize is that the critique of how he says things and not what he says, and there are people who have done the latter, but all the focus, especially in his first term, on how he said things just made him more likable to a lot of working class white people, because the focus on his rudeness, his brazenness, his lack of diplomacy, etc., I think probably resonated with a lot of people who associate indirectness with being a liar. And he's been caught in a lot of lies. I'm not disputing that at all, because how he speaks is not typical of someone born into wealth who is like a city boy billionaire. I know NYC is more direct, like New Yorkers are direct, but for his class and the circles that he's in, I was, what is he doing here? But I think that resonates, and that's something that people don't see in the rest of people they see in his status, with who know more indirect communication and politically correct language, etc., and diplomacy. And so even when he's caught in lies, the interpretation is still that he's more honest, which I'm not saying is true. I just think there's an interesting biad here, and something I've been thinking about is it's disturbing how susceptible people are to unwritten rules and how quickly fooled we are by marketing, politics, etc. And how people say things has a big impact. It's not distributed in the same way. Of like, tone policing is a major thing for Black folks at work. That's a big finding, one of my unwritten rules, which is the navigating the being assertive but not too aggressive at work. We also have the opposite of where if you say it in the right tone and it fits the right person, that people just nod their heads and don't think about what they're saying. I think if you are in a position where you want to do good, you have to know the style of your audience. Because I do see a lot of people who intend to do well, who, you know, run a nonprofit or doing research or whatever, but who don't learn the language of the people they're trying to help and don't listen to what their experience is, and then they miss the mark. Communication styles are scarily powerful. But I do remember around that time in 2016 having a conversation with someone who was from a very blue state and had never been around people different from her, who was really struggling in Florida. This was when I was at a university. And she was always pissing people off, not by offending them, but by how she was so worried she was going to offend them. She was like, oh, I don't mean to be offensive, and they were like, we are literally not that fragile, like, chill. And I was explaining to her, I was like, there's a thing in like working class culture about not being offended. There's like a sense of pride in that. And I remember she just got quiet and thought about that. Now the irony is, of course, what I was talking about in the last video about, there's a difference between indirect communication and the right to comfort for people in power, which is where you cannot have any conflict with me about where I have power. There are still a lot of working class white folks and white folks in general who get touchy about that, who can be very direct about where they see they don't have power, but then get very touchy about when you're like, okay, but don't you see how you have privilege in this area? And then they lose their shit. And so that's, of course, the hypocrisy, the distinction I see between direct and indirect communication versus the right to comfort. Because there are many cultures in the world that use indirect communication, and I made a video about that last week on the distinction.